Okay, I think it is recording now, and I can see your screen. Good.
Okay. All right. All right. Hey everyone. Welcome back. With that, we got to catch up on a little bit. I'm going to be going over the day three lecture, and I'm not sure how far we are on the labs, but these were the last three that I was going to be going over. And then with that, we'll get going on day week 12. We're gonna do days one and two on that. Bunch to go over today. Hopefully we'll be able to cover that. I'll definitely try to summarize and highlight as best as possible. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. The last part of the last week is this would be, it's this on path and brute force attack. With that, it's the first time I think in this course we're introducing on path. Basically, this is everything that was formerly called man in the middle attack. I think I mentioned before. There's a lot of initiatives in the corporate space, and cybersecurity is definitely part of that. Where they're calling it dismantling legacy terminology. A lot of things are trying to take out some certain terms. People are still a lot of the terms are going to stick around forever, regardless of how much you try to phase it out. A lot of people still say man in the middle. A lot of the courseware hasn't changed as well. And anywhere you go in the corporate world or anywhere else, you're gonna see a blend of what they're calling legacy technology terminology, as well as the new term. So on path is basically man in the middle. And on path makes sense too. They're basically talking about where can you attack or intercept things on the path that the traffic takes. And it could be it's typically where it's intercepting it either en route, like you can think of that on an actual physical line where maybe a threat actor gets connected within the path of that. Or this could also be used for wireless, where everything's broadcasting, everything's sending, and they manage to manipulate that traffic to get themselves logically in the middle of the traffic. There's a lot of different ways we'll go over. One is positioning. That's where I said we're talking about the network attacker just getting themselves in a position in the network to be able to intercept communication. Um, Interception, that's where they can manipulate you know a few things like DNS poisoning, ARP poisoning, things like that. We kind of already went to inject themselves and intercept that traffic. And then packet modification. This one is where they can craft network packets to spoof sending or receiving to try to manipulate that traffic. Um, we'll talk a bit about mitigation, but all in all, majority of these things are very hard to do with modern network appliances. Most modern Wi-Fi's out there are pretty good about not letting people. It has an idea of what its ARP traffic looks like, and when it sees something change, in a way that appears malicious, has a number of algorithms to say, hey, this MAC address is here, and this other thing that this other station ID. It's able to kind of identify some of the RF antenna capabilities to tell what traffic should be coming where. And this is a bit more than you really need to get into for the purpose of this lab or class or anything. But it involves with some sort of calculations on signal strength and interference to identify how far different stations are. If a MAC address is a certain RSSID value, and then all of a sudden it changes. These wireless routers are pretty smart now. They can figure out when things just don't look right. Yeah, a lot of these things are very hard to do today, but there's a ton of legacy technology out there, and attackers still get success regardless of how advanced modern technology is today. There's still old technology out there. A bit more eavesdropping. This is more along the lines of not necessarily doing any type of manipulation. Uh, it is way easier to simply just eavesdrop on traffic than to try to manipulate the packets, especially on wireless, to for trick your target computer into communicating with you. A lot of these man-in-the-middle attacks, you have to be able to communicate on the right protocol to, if you're trying to intercept and manipulate HTTP or HTTPS, you need to have a specialized application that can, respond in that correct protocol. So if you're simply just eavesdropping, you can just gather all the information, then take those PCAPs and dissect them for passwords, images, documents, things like that. So much easier there. And then the last one on the bottom here, SSL stripping. We'll talk a bit more. This is a lot harder to successfully do. Basically, you've got to somewhat beat the connection to happening, the legitimate connection to happen if you're the attacker. If I'm already logged on to my banking website with HTTPS and then something changes, I'll typically get like some notification from the browsers. Most of the modern browsers will give you some sort of prompt. This attack down here involves intercepting that communication and redirecting your target to a non-HTTPS website. If you're the attacker, you want to be sitting on the network all the time waiting for this to happen. It's more of an opportunistic approach. If you're doing this at like a coffee shop Wi-Fi, you're not going to do this to a target computer that's already connected to an HTTPS website. You want to have your fake HTTPS website ready to go, and new person joins, and you're going to respond first since you're on the local network, compared to them having to reach all the way out to the internet to these requests. So this is where that would work. Of course, the browser would still give you a bit of a warning, but it's easier to fool a target when this is happening, right in the beginning. They've first connected to the website. To them, nothing changed. They might not have the knowledge or know how to recognize that, the HTTPS, they're going to get a little lock. They might just it'll say, people get prompts all the time. It says proceed anyway, and they hit proceed anyway, and then maybe they're logging into the fake banking website. So this works more realistically in that manner. You're not necessarily going to be able to stop them if they're already connected to an HTTPS connection, but this will definitely work if you're just you have for example, I think I mentioned Wi-Fi Pineapple out there. It comes built in with all of this setup. You just connect. You can broadcast this from give it the SSID as a Starbucks, and you can you'll definitely fool some people into doing that, or that's how you would do that sort of pen test. Mitigation. So I kind of talked a lot. This is a very common with modern router. You buy a brand new Linksys name brand, anything. A lot of these are going to be highly enforced. It'll typically block traffic that looks like it's spoofing another host. It'll potentially block DNS protocols that aren't going to and from the appropriate DNS. So there's a lot of things out there that it'll automatically do. But in the end, there's unsecured devices out there. If you're coming in new and you need to mitigate this, I think the important thing is going to be back to the user awareness, letting people know, like, hey, this is a certificate matchup with the website you're trying to go to. Do we have that? Do we have this lock on the upper left here? Is it making sure people know that if they see that red encryption certificate validation not happening, that it's they should not proceed. They should report that. If your router doesn't, essentially it's doing intrusion detection prevention on its own. But if you don't have that, you should definitely have that on your network. That's where a third-party device on your network, an IDS and IPS, it'll start noticing when new MAC addresses start or duplicate MAC addresses start showing up. That the telltale sign of ARP poisoning. It'll alert when it sees two different IPSs, for example, DNS poisoning. Somebody's responding to DNS requests from a different address. A lot of these things will pop up. So, being able to monitor for malicious devices on a network is the best thing you can do as a network administrator in these cases. We had the lab earlier. What is ARP poisoning? It's basically sitting on the network and responding to ARP requests with your MAC address. You're the attacker. You're trying to, somebody sends out an ARP request for the DNS server. You'll respond with your MAC address. And if you're especially closer to the request, if you're on the local network, you can usually beat that response. You'll beat the legitimate DNS server to that ARP response, and now you can, pose as the DNS server on the network. A little bit more, with this example right here. Basically, it's not actually going directly to the hacker. It's going to that network access point, and you're going to beat that response before the internet server does, and then you'll be able to respond to those requests as if you were the host that they're looking for. I think we went over this already. I think this is a little bit of a, oh, sorry, went the wrong direction here. All right. And then DNS poisoning, very similar attack here. The DNS works almost the same way as our address resolution protocol. There's going to be a request the broadcast is sent out. Who's this IP, or what IP belongs to this domain, and being able to respond as the DNS server, provides that DNS poisoning. And that lab the other day, it was simulating that DNS poison example. Given the example of now the target machine is reaching out to the completely wrong IP address every time you type in that web that www whatever server.com. Again, a bit of a diagram here. Users issuing requests, and attacker will beat that request. Again, modern DNS servers, they will, let me go to the mitigation side of things. Modern DNS servers are able to kind of just detect these anomalies. Things change, and it doesn't recognize that sender as a trusted DNS resolver or something like that. This is something that this has been out for quite a while. It's not 100% adopted, but if you're setting up a DNSSEC, you're basically encrypting that connection between your DNS servers. In theory, you can enable it to only use DNSSEC for your DNS server to only do those requests using that. That's ideal. I would say it doesn't 100% exist out there in the internet still today. There's still going to be some DNS servers that don't fully support this. I would say a good chunk of them today do. If you have a DNS server in your local network and you want to only trust your major ISP DNS servers, or maybe Google DNS, Cloudflare, all these major DNS servers, DNSSEC will work. Now, I can't say this is true for all the way 100% around the world. I mean, depending on how you do business, you might be doing businesses with places that may not have the same technology in place, and you may need to trust some DNS servers that are out there that don't use DNSSEC. So it's not 100% in use, but for the most part, majority of the legitimate internet DNSSEC does work. I would just say, if you're in that position of setting up DNS on your corporate organization, just make sure that your DNS server in your in your organization is only getting DNS requests from trusted servers. Things like if you want to use Google DNS, if you want to use, if your internet service provider is Comcast and that's what you want to use, go ahead and you can go online and validate, what are the DNS server IPs, and you'll be pretty safe. And the biggest thing I think I mentioned earlier is, um, block. I would like to enforce blocking DNS to servers I don't trust on my corporate network. So, if I want to force all my users to use my DNS server. I don't want to let them use, point to, their own custom DNS server, and that will kind of help somewhat prevent, some DNS poison at that level. A few other obvious things: DNS software updates. All these DNS servers eventually get, vulnerabilities. Making sure your DNS server isn't susceptible to any vulnerabilities is a great way to ensure it doesn't get poisoned. And I'd say not on here. I would say my DNS server, I want to kind of keep it firewalled. I want to only let traffic that I think is important for that server to get out to. I wouldn't want to even let it be open to the World Wide Web. Only specific traffic that it needs to get to just protect that DNS server. It's you can kind of consider that a crown jewel in your environment. Port stealing, less common. Essentially, I would say less common in physical networks. So this is the idea of port stealing is, you know, at first think about it from a physical perspective. You have a legitimate port assigned to a switch somewhere in your data center, and less common before from a physical perspective would be an attacker gaining physical access and plugging in some sort of man-in-the-middle device. Um, Not completely impossible, but more improbable because it needs physical access. Today with the we went all these different virtual switches out that exist out there. You can This is a lot more realistic if you get your AWS or Azure admin credentials compromised. Threat actor can log on to your virtual switching infrastructure within AWS, and they can simply just you know stand up a virtual machine that's going to be acting like a minute man in the middle, and plug that into your virtual switch. So at a certain point in time, this is like, oh, all we got to do is worry about physical security. Today, with all these virtual switches out there, it's there's a ton of things that could go wrong if your cloud credentials get compromised, and this is just one of many of them out there. That they can open. In addition to this, they can open up a bunch of ports, allow their malicious IPs through. There's all sorts of things, but yeah, if they want to, if their goal is to intercept traffic and that's it, maybe they'll just configure a virtual switch port to one of their devices. Mitigating that, least privilege is important. You don't want your admin credentials floating around as best as possible. And then, I'll just highlight the intrusion prevention. Again, the big thing about intrusion prevention is a lot of these things will identify when something new happens on a network. If you have a new host in your management network, that can create an alert. Simple as that, or just a new host joining a network, and that might be enough to trigger an investigation to identify if you've got something weird on your network here. Let's see. All right, so we're kind of switching gears to brute force attacks, and to some degree, we did cover this too, on a few previous labs. But important things about brute force. It's exhaustive is one of the keywords here. Depending on how the brute force is set to configure, you're exhausting all combinations of the character sets that are defined in the brute force attack. And again, it's time consuming. It's unless the brute force attack has some custom configurations started off, it's going to start off at the very beginning of the character sets. If it's all uppercase A's, it's going to go there, and then the very next one is going to be all A's then B's. And if you're putting in uppercase, lowercase, numeric special characters, it's exponential to how many different combination or how much different password combinations are possible, to guess. And each one of those guesses, is going to rely on computational strength. So, to some degree, it's fast. It's happening very fast, but because it's a exponential increase on how many different combinations that of passwords that it's going to attempt, it could take pretty long. And I think um, ideally I think that they've discovered that the best way to increase the amount of time for brute forces is password length. Of course, all of it adds to it, but I think that's the highest exponential increaser is just character length. You've got your alphabet is already 26 characters versus the amount of numbers or maybe the amount of special characters that that it will take. So that just simply, that's the biggest increaser on preventing brute force here. um you know so a few things here on brute forces. Ideally they're selecting targets, but I'd say every day 24/7 on the internet, there's scanners out there that's gonna brute force any open authentication port that it can find. So that's ideally, if an attacker is targeting something specific, yeah, that happens too, but it's generally happening all day 24/7 on the internet. But then again, if attackers being specifically targeting something, here's some considerations here. um, if I'm an attacker and I want to do a brute force, I'm going to go log on to, if it's a website that has an account creation page, I'm going to go and I'm going to run through it, and I'm going to look at my password complexity. I'm going to go in and type in special characters to see what special characters I can exclude from my brute force attack. Just to any single thing I can exclude from my brute force attack is gonna, exponential. Everything's exponential. It's gonna, that it'll decrease the amount of time it takes. And if you're a lot of passwords, they won't take in quotation marks or something like that. So, I'll eliminate those characters from my brute force attempt. If it's rare, but there's going to be ones out there that might exclude all special characters. If that's the case, I'm going to absolutely remove that from my brute force combination. And I was mentioning earlier, you know, by default, a lot of these will start from the very first character, and try each combination. There is a few out there that can start off at a certain thing. You can set it maybe each character is changed by one because it's unlikely that it's all A's, but again, that's really dependent. Biggest thing for brute forcing is resources. If I'm cracking password hashes that I've stolen, typically computational resource is going to be my biggest hindrance, or my biggest calculator on how long it's going to take. The other aspect of this could be if you're doing an online brute force attack, meaning I'm trying to authenticate to a web page, you might be completely restricted to how long that authentication process takes through the internet. So, and all of that, you calculate that out. It's very time consuming. Um, I kind of touched on this a second ago. So there's password cracking and then network protocol attacks. So the password cracking is I've stolen password hashes from a device. We talked a little bit about taking a look at the etc password file on Linux systems. That's essentially the hashed password of the users there. So you've collected those. Maybe you've gained access. You've already got root access there, and you want to get the passwords of all the users on that system. That's going to be a password cracking example. And then, I think, in that one lab, we did a word list attack or dictionary attack. That's always one option. John the Ripper can be simply set to do brute force. You don't need to, you can set it to run it without a password file, what character sets, and it'll go ahead and just brute force crack it. So that's an option. And then that's where it's could be time consuming. Network protocol attacks. I believe we did that other lab where we ran that word list against an FTP server that was open on the Metasploitable box. So that's one example of a network protocol attack. But all these live running protocols mentioned here, FTP to be in the first one, like we use in the lab, SSH, RDP, those are all network protocol attacks. And then in the other example, I have my Python script and my GitHub. Those were all network protocol attacks, and they were set to either take brute forcing or wordless. And I think in that one lab, I think we used the tool called Hydra for that password attack. So yeah, all of these kind of explain the difference, whether it's an offline, and we're going to see later in the slides. So you could consider this password cracking an offline attack versus this network protocol attack being an online attack. So, mitigating password attacks. I'll start with MFA. So that's the biggest one. I kind of think, password attacks are happening, but my users are more likely to be phished or social engineered for the password. So I always consider single factor passwords something that's eventually going to get it's going to get discovered by a bad actor no matter what. So multi-factor is going to be the thing here that gives you the best overall protection, because it's protecting you from both the brute force attacks as well as phishing, social engineering. But strong password policies are still a must. Adding in the password length, adding in how many uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and how often this password rotates. Ideally, not only are you planning for your users' passwords to be phished, social engineered, you're also planning that passwords will eventually be brute force. So the idea is that you have users change their passwords a certain amount of time, so that way, even if it were successfully brute force, by the time it gets brute force, it's already something new. The recommendation for how long that is has evolved and changed over time. I think the latest I've heard as a good standard is 90 days. In addition to that, I would factor in, is any of this covered in a compliance requirement? I don't know off the top of my head what PCI says, but PCI does have definitions for the first two on what they should be. And then I think PCI in the most recent version does cover MFA, and then of course IDS is gonna come into play. If you're having, if your IDS is monitoring failed authentications, a typical indicator, 10 failed followed by a success might be an indicator of a brute force successful or something like that. And then rate limiting, you wanna either completely lock out or temporarily lock out an account after a certain amount of failed attempts. This would make that brute forcing so much slower, less successful. And then a legitimate user, they'll get a notice they're locked out, and they maybe have to go to their there may be a process to get unlocked. Go through their manager, go through the help desk, something like that. Yeah, offline password cracking. We kind of touched on this a little bit. For offline password cracking, you either need the hashed or encrypted form of the files. In that example, I talked about John the Ripper. That's one example of where you might get passwords from. Maybe the Windows landman hash or the Linux etc shadow file. But in another example, a lot of internet accounts, to use social media, for example, there's a database, and in that database, there's some table somewhere with user IDs and a encrypted form of their password. Or it might be encrypted and hashed, some of that combination. A lot of times, For example, I was at my prior employer, and you know, I knew at one point what the process was that we took the passwords, and it was intended to be unknown. It was a multiple form of hashing and encryption. That way, you can't simply run John the Ripper on these things or something like that, because John the Ripper is looking for hashes, or encryption algorithms. So if you do multiple on there, um, basically the in this example, if somebody just stores in a database using just hashing, John the Ripper will still be able to crack these passwords. You just got to know what the hash is, and depending on if you see in a database and there's a table with a column that says passwords, and every password is the same length, then you know it's some sort of hashing algorithm, because hashing outputs a fixed length. If you see it's varying lengths, then it's some form of encryption. So it could be AES encryption or something like that. So there's a few things to consider that offline password cracking. Um, but yeah, the standard ones, Windows, Linux, those ones, we know those hashings, and we know that John the Ripper can eventually crack those as well. Let's see. Um, I think week one, rainbow tables. Basically, what rainbow tables are is somebody's already done a they've already taken passwords, words, and they've already hashed them. So instead of your computer running through the word lists and doing that hashing algorithm live, you can download these tables, and you're simply doing a text match, hash to hash equals this password. It runs computationally way faster. We're talking, you can go down from days to seconds. However, these rainbow tables are humongous. You need terabytes of space, or to download these rainbow tables. But if you've got if this is for an attacker, that might be the thing. They just download rainbow tables of pre-hashed password and text values, and that is a significant time saver in offline password hacking. I want to say there's online sites out there. It's been a long time since I looked, that you can just go in and drop in a hash, and they'll search it for you. It costs money. It's not free typically, and they maintain a list of rainbow tables, and they can do that for you. So something to keep in mind as well. Um, there's a lot of ways to get passwords out there for just a few dollars. Online password attacks. That's what we were talking about earlier. FTP, SSH, RDP, or it could simply be these, basically any form that's sitting on the internet. You go to your banking webpage, you see username and password. An attacker can build a custom password attacking thing. The example of that that Python script I have. It's basically, I set it up to find which form fields are my username and password on that website that I want to attack, and it's essentially doing the same thing. It's either hitting it with a word list, or it's doing a brute force. So, but mainly online password attack is anything that's actively happening using the whatever protocol is in place to authenticate, whether it's a web page using HTTP, HTTPS, or a protocol like RDP or SSH or anything like that. Uh, I think we've kind of covered all of these here. I think password attacks, nearly the same thing as brute force attacks. Big, again, multi-factor, best one, and lockouts. All these things are gonna, just like any brute forcing or even social engineering in general. It doesn't have to just simply be a password attack. I kind of look at this as identity access management. I think that's the encompassing term that should encompass all of these as far as account mitigations here. Mm, Talked a bit about hashing. Like I said earlier, it's going to produce a fixed size characters, and that's how you know it's a hashed value. And some of the hashes will have specific character sets. I don't know them off the top of my head, or may have a prefix or suffix depending on the hashing out there, and that you may be able to recognize it. I've definitely got friends that are in the encryption field. You know, they can look at a hash and they know what it is. I myself do not. I've got to take a look at the length, and there's few things out there that will attempt to recognize it, that are all available online as well. But yeah, so as a result, because it's fixed, because it's a one way, these are typically used for authentications. Like I was saying though earlier, a lot of big companies, they're gonna come up with their own custom way of storing passwords. It might be maybe they've created their own algorithm. Maybe they're doing a series of hashing and encryption. That way, the idea being if their password database ever gets stolen, it's not going to be simple for somebody to take those password hashes and reverse them back to plain text passwords. Yeah, again, encryption, that's the other option. And it's all dependent. A lot of people like to rely on the hashing because it's the idea of hashing is I'm typing in my password to, let's say, LinkedIn. In theory, LinkedIn doesn't know my password. They're just running it through a hash in. If I were to type in a brand new password today, make it really long, really unique, in theory, it doesn't exist on a rainbow table and nobody knows the password. If I store it in encryption, they're using a key, they can decrypt my password. Um, I always get worried when I sign up for something and there's a forgot password. And instead of it creating a new password for me, it's going to send me what my password is. I'm thinking either my password's being stored in plain text or in a simply reversible or decryptable way. So something to keep in mind if you ever see that out there. If your password's either stored in plain text or it's either using encryption rather than hashing. Um, kind of been over the asymmetric versus symmetric. The main point is symmetric, same key to encrypt and decrypt versus asymmetric is going to be a different key. And in the asymmetric use case, typically you keep the user that's holding all the encrypted information is going to maintain that private key, and they're going to send out that public key so people can encrypt it so where they can decrypt it. And it's intended to you protect that private key because that private key has more power than the public key. Uh, so so it says RAR and hash cracking. I would say RAR is just one file compression type. Um, less common today that I see things, being stored securely via a file compression algorithm, but like you can zip something and password protect it just today, just as easy as before. You could, RAR. There's tons of other compression utilities that will encrypt at the same time. Just like if I were to download a database of passwords, or I get the hashes off of a workstation, you can actually do password cracking on these compressive files as well. So just something to keep in mind. These can be cracked as well, using the same type of tools. And we talked about John the Ripper. I think that's the one that I've used the most. Hashcats also, I've seen that out there. I think Hashcat might be less featured but easier to download. Might be something that I mentioned. Mass scan attackers can easily download it from GitHub and run it without an installation and a lot of dependencies. I think Hashcat is similar. I think it's more lightweight though. I have less familiarity with Hashcat. We didn't talk much about hybrid attacks. But a good example of hybrid would be where you're taking words and you're adding on maybe number combinations to the end. So you're taking words from the dictionary attack. Like sometimes people like to, um, let's say my password is Ivan, and then I require special characters. So they say, so I'll start off with Ivan exclamation, and then 90 days later it says change my password. Okay, instead of exclamation, I'm gonna, instead of shift one, I'm gonna do shift two, and it'll be the at sign, and then 90 days later, so on. So that's where John the Ripper, I know it supports a bit of a hybridization, and if you know how to set that up correctly, you can do a pretty good hybrid attack. And the purpose of that is to kind of add that where people might randomize typically the tail end characters of their password would be like somewhat of a keyboard walk or something that changes periodically. All right, so this is the end of this one. We'll take, let's see, that's about 45-ish minutes so far. Let's see, we'll take a few. Let's see what slides we have here. All right, we'll take 10 minutes. It's 6 o'clock, and then I'll jump into Linux privilege escalation. We'll see how far we get here. This was the stopping point for Tuesday. I want to see if we can get into the next slide here. So let's take 10, and we'll pick back up with the this week's content with Linux privilege escalation. All right, be back in about 10. Thanks all. All right. We'll go ahead and get back started. Just check in, screen share, audio, still good?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. We'll see how much more we can get through on today. So this is the start of week 12. I kind of didn't set the outline in stone because we're being a little flexible this week, but we're really getting going with the Linux privilege escalation section. And if we got some time, Windows privilege escalation, and probably we won't be able to squeeze anything more out of that today. The remainder two sections, we have web application vulnerabilities and vulnerability scanning. So a few more to cover for this week. We'll probably be able to kind of catch up as we go, but yeah, we'll go ahead and get started with the Linux privilege escalation today. All right. So there's various methods, getting privilege escalation on Linux. I think, the one of the most common that I've seen is just exploiting vulnerabilities on applications or the operating system itself. I can't, we'll talk more about Windows in the next one. Like Windows has tons of ways to exploit to gain privilege escalation, but Linux not significantly smaller. So we'll talk about a bit more of these things. So, top one, vulnerabilities. I think I've done a few labs myself where I'll you look at what applications are running on a Linux system. Generally speaking, people consider Mac and Linux more secure. So that kind of ends up being shooting themselves in the foot. Windows has all these vulnerabilities. Sometimes it creates better processes. I think people are more prone to run their Windows updates. Windows sends you a prompt to do updates. Mac does a good job of it well, but if you're not running a Linux system with a graphical user interface, or maybe you've got a Linux application that you never log on to, it runs reliably. Nobody touches it. I've seen examples where there's really old Linux systems running out there because it just works. It runs well. They still don't even touch it. So, in that sense, I've seen older things running on Linux distros out there. Taking part of a 10 test, I remember seeing something really old running. I went to VulnDB, saw that this thing had a ton of vulnerabilities, went to exploitDB, downloaded it, and all I did was download this exploit onto the system, ran it, and then it just, like in a snap of fingers, it turned my account into root. So there's some vulnerabilities out there, and I think the biggest thing I see a lot of times that Linux can go untouched. It's a double-edged sword. Linux just can be so reliable. No one logs into it. It keeps running whatever server it runs. Nobody touches it, and to that same degree, nobody does the updates on it. So vulnerabilities can definitely hurt you on the Linux system out there. And misconfigurations as well is a big one. Similar to how Windows, maybe Mac, easy to use, Linux takes a bit more of a stepping stone to start leveraging. To that degree, some misconfigurations, and we'll talk about some of these misconfigurations in a second. Just not knowing how some things work can create issues to gain privileges on a Linux system. And then, weak authentication, super simple, super common. That happens out there. Passwords, people might just give it, it's like I said, I see it to this day, people putting weak passwords out there. It still happens. So I think with Linux in particular, though, kind of, a lot of times Linux will run with its own passwords on the system. In an organization, maybe Windows is joined to a domain, and those domain accounts get passwords refreshed. They get passwords, maybe enforced with complexity. Again, going back to like the things that make Linux so good, people might set a password on this Linux system, and it goes unchanged for 10 years. That goes way beyond the time link for passwords to get cracked or whatever. So, these things can become a problem. Again, it's kind of like a repeating thing. All these things that make Linux so good, if people aren't paying attention to these things, it becomes a problem. All right. So back in, I think it was week 3, maybe we started doing our Linux fundamentals. There was setting up permissions on files, folders, and then there's a set UID, set GID permissions. These can be set so that certain programs can run with escalated privileges. Um, in these examples, certain utilities may need to you install a program on a Linux system for other users to use, and for some reason you might want that program to run with elevated privileges. Maybe that program needs to manipulate files in a web server directory. Maybe you want people to be able to update a certain web page. There's tons of scenarios where maybe there's a reason to give a certain program escalated privileges, and ideally you want that program to be configured with a limited set of parameters so that it can only do these things that you want it to do with elevated privileges. In these examples, an attacker might find a program that has these escalated privileges on a system, and maybe that program takes unintended input, or maybe you can feed it a file and it runs that with escalated privileges. That could be a way that maybe this program it takes commands that weren't intended, and that you go ahead and create another administrative account on the system, and the attacker escalates its privileges that way. So even though there's legitimate purposes you might want to use to have certain applications run with escalated privileges, those applications aren't built with specific guardrails in place, so it only does what it's intended to do. It can be exploited by a threat actor to perform privilege escalation. In our Linux labs, the student account is able to do sudo to give itself admin privileges to perform functions. For the purpose of this lab, that's fine, but you would almost never have just some regular user that can just sudo and do run admin commands. Of course, you've got legitimate users out there in your network. You want to put them on it's called the sudoers list on the Linux system. And, think about it, it'd be like maybe sysadmins that need to do things on the system. Similar, thinking about the idea of our student account having sudo rights, there may be some accounts out there that had been granted sudo privileges, maybe temporarily, or maybe they were troubleshooting. Maybe they wanted to the system wasn't running correctly. Maybe they said, okay, let me let that user run it as sudo, see if it works. Okay, it's still not working. It's not the user's thing. Maybe they don't change it back and take that person off the sudo. So attackers will take a look at what users does have sudo permissions, and trying to perform actions as that user. So, again, in our lab environment, super normal for a regular account to do that, but it's definitely not super normal to have just any old user on that sudoers list on a Linux system. Mitigating privilege escalation, and so it's funny because a lot of times I think I mentioned keep software up to date, and in Windows, it nags you about updates. Sometimes it depending on how it's set up, it may say, hey, you need to, I'm going to force you to shut down and update this thing right now. Linux will not do that to you. It's going to say, you're an adult. I'll let you run out-of-date software if you want to, and let you do it as long as you want. And, may not even tell you, unless you're running command line, unless you actually do the update commands, it probably you won't even know there's an update. So, and that's where on here Linux, it's definitely less forgiving in that sense. And we talked a bit about secure configurations. That sudoers thing is really important. I typically haven't seen use cases today for the set UID, set GID out there, but I'm certain there's use cases out there that exist in some some niche uses out there where somebody has a program that it wants to run that, but they don't want people to log on as administrators. So there's that secure configurations are out there. Um, I've not done a lot of security scanning on Linux systems. I think there are a number of things out there that can identify these vulnerabilities out there. I'm recalling an audit script out there, but I think there's some audit scripts that checks for these types of things on Linux machines out there. But definitely something to look for if you're doing something like that and hardening a Linux system. Um, there's something out there. Um, so it's called Stigs. Let me see. I'm trying to figure out what the. Let me look up what the. So it's like secure technology. There you go. Secure technology implementation guide. Let me drop a link in here. So these are, kind of recommended by government entities to securing systems. So I want to say this is always a good reference for a operating system you're not familiar with secure configurations out there. It has setting strong passwords, checking for certain files. So I want to say I've seen some Stig auditing scripts in place. I've never used them myself, but I think that's a good reference. It might make your system a little too secure, but that's not your problem if you're working in that security engineering space. All right. Talk a little bit more about general privileges here. So, types of privileges on Linux, super user root. Um, important thing that you always want to keep in mind. You want to use this account as little as possible. A lot of times, when you're first setting up a system, may need to log in as root. There might be some specific applications that say log in as root and then do this. But ideally, you don't want to be logged on doing all sorts of things with the root user. This will, you know, not just from a cybersecurity perspective where you could accidentally run some malware in your system. It's pretty easy to break a system just logged on as root whenever you want. So use that. It says use it judiciously. What you want to typically do is be logged on as your regular user and then sudo when needed. The idea being like I'm even only doing sudo when I need to do certain things that require it. I'm not even doing it for every single command. So again, least privilege is important space here. Um, on Linux systems, we talked about this. You typically use groups for shared access to things. If there's an HR directory, something like that, you default will have access to these things in that space. Pretty self-explanatory for groups. We talked a bit about sudo command or sudo privilege users on there. I've not done this in quite some time, but I want to say that you can actually have some granular tuning with what can be done or what you can sudo, certain things. I want to say you can even break it down to which executables. So in like in the use cases we've had for our labs, I would say instead of saying my student account can do sudo on everything, I would identify which programs, Wireshark, all sorts of other things that can be done for, and limit it to that. Um, Similarly, I think I already talked about this use case. There's specific programs where you might want any user to be able to run with administrative privileges. So you set it on either the file or group or user itself, and it'll run as admin here. Let's see. So kind of talking about our attack chain. Um, Privilege escalation typically happens, after that initial access. Areas where I've really implemented or really kind of done that privilege escalation. I've already maybe I've gained access to a Linux system. Maybe it's running a web server, and I get on that web server. I exploit an exploit on that web server, and now I've got command line access to that Linux system. But I'm running as the web server account. The web server account may not have that access I need to do too much damage. So that's where that initial access comes in place. I gained initial access to the system. Now I want to do that privilege escalation. And once I'm on that system, I'm looking for maybe other users' information. Maybe I want to see what users have sudo privileges, what users are in admin groups, or maybe even what applications are running on the system that are vulnerable, and kind of leveraging that to exploit the system to gain that privilege escalation on the Linux system. And then, just going back to that attack chain, you can reference that MITRE attack chain. Once I've gained access to that system, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to, download the database of user passwords, all those types of things? What am I doing with the access that I've escalated to? That kind of covers, where privilege escalation lives on, in the attack chain. And each one of these operating systems has their own set of common things you can do to gain that privilege escalation. Few examples. So this is a really popular one that was not too long ago, and it was on everything. There's, I think everyone basically had to patch their Linux systems, and uh, I would say this still has been the root cause of a few other popular hacks out there. I mean, if you were to Google "dirty cow" exploit, you'd actually find some recent cybersecurity articles where it was just a basic privilege escalation that you could execute on the Linux system, and no matter what account you ran it as, you would gain that root access to the system. So, really popular one out there that big effort to try to fix this issue, and there's still some ones out there today that are surprisingly running. I'm less familiar with this one, but interestingly, it became an issue with the sudo utility. So basically allowed people to execute commands as the root user, even if they weren't on the sudo list. So it kind of bypassed that a sudo check of whether somebody had those sudo privileges. And a few other things to reference here if you're interested in popular. Again, these Linux ones. I googled each one of these the other week, and I found examples of where it says 2020, not too long ago, but this is you're talking like a 4-year-old vulnerability, and it's still out there on systems. So and it kind of uh, you know unless somebody's paying attention to a Linux system, it's definitely not going to get patched very often. Mitigation. I think I've kind of hit this on a few times. Regular updates and patching, secure configurations. Ideally, you want to do vulnerability scanning. Like I said, I think there's some audit scanners out there that look for these secure configurations. I recall seeing some, these, if you refer to that STIGs URL, I recall seeing a few of these things in the past that have been really helpful to identifying if there's some misconfigurations in your Linux system. And I myself lean on those things because, even though I consider myself a proficient Linux user, I still feel like because I'm not logged on to a Linux machine every day, checking my configure, like I still need some help. And I think it's really rare. There's definitely people out there that they're logged on to Linux every day. That's their maybe even there's a few people out there that run that as their primary day-to-day systems, but most of us are not. Most of us are operating our Windows GUI or our MacBook GUI. And I kind of recommend, yeah, unless you're logged in every day, use some of these references for your secure configuration for Linux systems. All right. This is a pretty hefty deck. I think Windows kind of deserves its own day here, so I don't want to rush through the Windows section. Um, we'll stop here. So let me drop in the chat where we're left off. So, Joel, I'm not sure if we got through the labs on day 3, but this is where I left off. So I'll drop that in there. If we haven't done those labs, let's get those going. And for this week, week 12, we'll start here and we'll catch up on the rest of this as best as we can, and but we'll definitely be able to catch up. So these are the labs for that are still pending as far as I know, and then we'll move on to we'll cover at least Windows privilege escalation and web vulnerabilities. We'll see if we can get to the vulnerability scanning as well in the next day. But yeah, we'll leave off right here because I want to give Windows enough time to go over that because there's a good number of things on the Windows privilege escalation section. Um, any questions on Linux privilege escalation? All right. Let me quickly pop up the lab for this one to kind of go over. Let me get my OneDrive open. All right. So let's kind of go over this a little bit. So this one's going to be a little bit of a Metasploit lab. Um, where we're going to be gaining access to a Windows system. So a few things to check on here. So one, you're going to open up your Kali Linux. I think you're going to open up the Metasploit console. Just like we've done before, there's a number of exploits that Metasploit uses out there. PsExec is a very common one for executing commands on a Windows system. So basically, when you gain, we call it pop a box, you gain access to a Windows system, you're going to be controlling it through the Metasploit console. So this lab is just kind of get that familiarity of gaining access to a Windows system through Metasploit, and then we're going to kind of build on this. So just somewhat of a starter lab. So in this case, you have that password already. So the just like before, you open up a module in Metasploit. This one being the exploits, Windows, SMB, PsExec. You go ahead and set all your vulnerability, set your environment variables. So this being the target machine right here, the user and password. So in this case, the lab, we already got a password to use, and we're just going to be connecting to it through the Metasploit. Important thing to note here, this is in this lab, you're going to be exploiting a Windows system using these credentials, and we're going to be configuring a payload. Basically, this is going to run on the target machine and connect back out to our Kali box. And the reason we're doing this is, in a lot of ways, I can't just attack a machine from the internet because the firewall is going to block me. In this example here, using Metasploit, and the Windows machine is actually going to execute a connection out to my machine, and that's going to get to the firewall if it's originating on the trusted side of things. We're talking about stateful firewalls. They're letting people connect out from the inside of the trusted part of the firewall. So in addition to setting these variables for the PsExec exploit, we're setting the variables for the payload. So we're going to be using this payload here. This IP is going to be the Kali IP, and we're using port 4444. This is actually, I might even be the default port, but it's definitely a pretty obvious port, and then we're going to run the exploit, and you should see something very similar. And then the key thing to look for, interpreter session open, showing the your target machine and your Kali box. And from here, we're gonna validate that we're onto the Windows system. So, get UID. You should see that your NT Authority system, which is the Windows computer account sysinfo. You should see the DC server, and that's all. So, that's all for this one. It's basically getting started with Metasploit and getting access to a Windows machine and leveraging Meterpreter. And from here, if you're the threat actor, from here, you've got a pretty not going to say a pretty obscure connection on that Windows machine. If I'm on that Windows machine, I'm not going to see anything that this is running. Like, I'm not going to see a pop-up. I'm not going to see a program opening or anything like that. It'll be I'll see this network connection if I run netstat, but it's going to be somewhat obscure that this is running. And then if I were to launch additional from this Meterpreter section, if I were to run command lines, creating user accounts, if I have that privilege, or if I wanted to dump data credentials of all the users on the system, it would be oblivious to the person. Like, they're not going to have any kind of user interface giving away that this is happening on the system. So yeah, again, this is just a start on the using Metasploit to gain access to the Windows system. All right, but yeah, so that's the lab we're going to leave off on today. Any questions? All right. We'll pick up on the rest of this on the next day. We'll get going with the Windows privilege escalation, website vulnerabilities, and some vulnerability scanning. All right. Thanks, everyone. Again, Joel, I'll be on for about 15 more minutes. Joel will be here as well. If you guys want to get started on the labs. If not, thanks. Have a good evening.
Thank you. See you on Saturday.
Yep.
Thank you, Ivan.
All right. Have a good one.